there's no wrong questions and there's no stupid questions, and it's just questions.
Today's guest is Dr. Yoed Kenett. He's a psychologist and a creativity researcher. You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. Dr. Kenett's research shows that creativity is enhanced by making connections between very different concepts. And he shows that creative people are better at asking interesting questions. If you enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll subscribe to The Science of Creativity and click like and rate the show, because it helps people like you find the show. Now, here's our interview. I'm delighted to have Professor Yoed Kenett on the show. We're going to talk about his cutting-edge creativity research. Yoed, welcome to The Science of Creativity.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to be here.
Yoed, I've been following your research for years, and to get ready for our interview, I read some of your new scientific publications from 2023 and 2024. Very impressive. They're in the top academic journals. I think they're brilliant and cutting edge. Yeah. And for people who aren't scientists, could you give us a summary? What do you study about creativity?
So what I'm fascinated or semi-obsessed with is this other term that we sometimes call knowledge, and what is the role of our knowledge in creativity? How does what we know helps us be creative? And that sometimes seems like a bit of a paradox, because we think about knowledge or a memory as something that stores old information. I've learned this already. I know this. While we think about creativity as something new, we create. But in fact, our ability to create is very much strongly based on our prior knowledge. So my research has been extensively looking into how the way we organize our knowledge helps us search, connect, create new ideas. It's like a little bit like Google of our mind, though. So we need to have a mapping of our information, and then we need some way to search and retrieve that information. This is like how we go on Google or now talk with ChatGPT. So there's at least two things that are happening: structure of our information or a knowledge base, and there's some processes that operate on this knowledge. And both of these issues, even though they're very intuitive and are embedded in a lot of theories and creativity, were really difficult to study for a very long time. But over the last couple of decades, through the use of computational tools coming from mathematics, computer science, statistics, physics, we have now a lot of power and ability to model these tools. And then I go into the world and look at how people are actually trying to reverse engineer their internal mind, their way that they're thinking.
Right. Yeah. A lot of the creativity research basically finds that a creative idea is always a combination of existing ideas. It's always mental material that's already in your head. And you're looking at kind of the underlying mechanisms of how those combinations happen. Is that right?
That's right, exactly right. There's a fantastic paper by colleague Professor Anna Abraham, and the title of it is how semantic memory or our knowledge is the scaffolding of imagination. And I use that when I think about creativity. We need to have an infrastructure that allows us to create, to build, to recombine. These are terms that we use for a long time, very, very subjectively and hand-wavingly. And now we have ways to better formalize and move towards more quantitative measures of this structure, of these processes, of this, how our knowledge allows us to search and expand and create new ideas, new information.
You call it associative thinking, is that right? What is that?
Yeah. So this goes back into a very classic, well-known theory in creativity that was proposed in the 1960s by a researcher whose name was Sarnoff Mednick. Mednick was not a creativity researcher. He studied schizophrenia more than anything. And he proposed a theory that's called the associative theory of creativity. That theory, again, there's a lot of different views on it, but a lot of people agree that it makes some sense, argues that What differentiates between low and high creative individuals is something about their memory structure that allows them to act in this creative process, which is what he called the ability to expand and move away in one's memory and create new connections between ideas that are remote. This new combination, the more the original ideas were farther apart abstractively in this abstract representation or maps or space, the more novel the new idea will be. But also it has to be appropriate. So there's all these at least two dimensions. So the way that we search is through a mechanism or a process that we call associative thinking, which is, I think everybody, a lot of people relate to the ability that when I think of something, I just trail off. This goes all the way back to William James and then Freud's ideas of stream of thought, that I move from one thing to the other by associations. And we want to argue, also with a colleague and dear friend Roger Beatty, we've just wrote a paper that tries to make this argument that this associative thinking is a general mechanism in creativity. So as we are trying to elucidate what this extremely elusive, complex, multidimensional construct that we call creativity is. So this is what I mean about these processes, is this ability to search. How are we searching our memory when we think about creativity? There's a lot of things to unpack under just this one sentence with from cognitive perspectives. Is this attention? Is this working memory? Is this intelligence? How are we searching? How are we retrieving? How are we choosing what information to focus on when we are doing this? It also relates to mind wandering and daydreaming and spontaneous. Just, I'm slowly in the mode, I'm just thinking about stuff when I'm driving or am I in the shower, things like that. So this associative thinking ability is actually something that's very basic in our day-to-day cognition.
Well, I'm curious if you could give an example. So the first thing I thought of was Reese's peanut butter cups. So it's a snack food that has
Yeah.
chocolate outside and peanut butter on the inside. So it's a combination of peanut butter and chocolate. So what would you call that? Is that a creative association?
It could be for you. So one thing is always, it's important to say that creativity is very individualized. Well, two things that I would like to say is one, that we're all creative, and the other is that each of us has their own internal world, and that's something that's very hard to study, or has been. The classic example, again, this goes all the way back to Mednick's original paper, is this argument that we have some evidence for that, which is if you would ask low creative people and high creative people, no matter how you define that, again, that's a topic on its own, to say whatever they can think of to the word table, then the lower creative individuals or individual would almost always say chair as the first thing that comes to mind. And then they wouldn't have a lot of other ideas. While the higher creative individuals will also likely say chair as the first thing that comes to mind, but they will have more ideas that seem to be less and less typical of the word table and are more and more idiosyncratic. They have a wider net of ideas that come up when they think about tables. It could be anything that seems to the outside viewer as maybe weird or less common. Embedded again in a lot of theories and creativity is that creativity involves the ability to move away from typicality. So if I want to come up with novel or original ideas, I need to think of something that is very far away, again, this sort of abstract space of our knowledge that allow me to come up with something that is unique or unexpected or rare.
I like that table example. So let's go further. I think in the experiments, you would say something like, come up with 10 words. And if I try to be really uncreative, I'm going to think of words that are similar to a table. So I'll say chair, maybe I'll say dinner, maybe I'll say plate because plates are on the table.
Exactly.
So, what would be some examples of distant or far away associations?
This is a great question. And we have to talk about question asking as well. The way that we do this specific line of research is through using, again, computation tools that come in from computational linguistics, like ChatGPT, and a lot of people know ChatGPT. And we use these tools to create a score, a quantitative score of the similarity between two responses. So table and chair are very similar, and because they share a lot of features together. But table and mouse maybe are less similar. And the inverse of similarity is distance. So we use this to quantify distance, and then we have people come up with associations. It's usually, as you said, 10 or as many as they can in a minute, and then we measure how they sort of trail off in their memory and quantify these distances and measure them. So people that are less creative tend to stay closer, relatively speaking, to their starting point. So if it's, for example, a lot of times we also just ask people to come up with all the animals that they can think of. So this is a different task, but it's a similar retrieval task. So less creative people would say more typically known animals, dog, cat, mouse, and they stay more in the sort of the typically expected subcategories of animals, pets, mammals, fish, birds, etc. Higher creative individuals will probably also say cat, dog, etc., but they will say more rare example of animal names, which could be either very specific because they know more information, or they could be just rare. It seemed to be like less connected. They would move from cat and dog to maybe, I don't know, water tarantula, which is not the expected retrieval typical process that we see with people. So this is what I'm trying to mean about distance. This idea of distance is extremely important in creativity because of all these ideas and theories that remoteness of ideas, which is one of the way we think about an original idea, we can quantify that idea of remoteness as being farther away, as being more distant. And we have now automatic tools to quantify what that distance means. Again, there's always caveats and problems with that, but we have shown that this really does relate to creativity across many studies. So more creative people are better able to come up with less expected responses, and our results, just looking at the structure of their knowledge, whether it's groups or individuals, we find that what would be expected as less common ideas, for them they are somehow more closer together. So for them, dog and water tarantula make more sense, and so they would retrieve that. They would move from the first word to the second word more likely than less creative individuals, where they would say the more typically categorized categories of animals. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
So these associations, obviously, it's something that takes place in your mind. You have all of these concepts in your mind, and some of them are more similar to each other, and some of them are more different from each other. So if you're one of these people that's more creative and you have more of these distant associations, does it just mean you have more stuff in your brain? You memorized more stuff? Or does it mean the stuff is linked together? I don't know what to say. That
Yeah.
they have the same amount of stuff as the uncreative people, but it's just connected differently. So what's going on?
So this question is really good, but also extremely difficult, because this is actually part of the ongoing discussion. Is exactly that. Is this about having more stuff? They know more. We know that creative people are also more intelligent to a point, and they have lower filtering, so they actually process more information, and which is maybe why they have things more connected to each other. We know that they have more links between, so there's more the structure, how things are organized is less structured in a way. It's more random, which is a way for them potentially to sort of search wider in their memory. Then there is a completely sort of, in a way, a different alternative camp, scientific camp, that says no, the only thing that matters is the process of retrieving information that is different in creative people. William James, probably the founder of psychology, who also talked a little bit about creative people towards the end of the 19th century, he said that creative people choose ideas like stirring a cauldron of different information. They just randomly retrieve them or something like that. I butchered a little bit the example. So maybe the way that they are retrieving is the way they're searching and then choosing their ideas is different, and it doesn't have anything to do about the structure of information. And then we actually, I just wrote a paper on this where we do show that more creative people are more random like in how they are searching their information. And a lot of research has shown in the past that creative people are not just able to come up with more distant ideas, but they are also quicker when they do that. So if you had a low creative and a high creative individual asking them to come up with all the things that they can think of to the word table in a minute, then a less creative individual would say about 8 to 10 words perhaps, but a high creative individual would say 14. So there's something that's different, not just about their knowledge, but also how they are searching and retrieving through it. And then there are two different views about what potentially is the secret sauce in this specific topic in creativity, the structure or the process. And there's been evidence for both. And the answer is like usually it's an interaction between the two of them. This is actually really my main focus of the research on how the structure of one's knowledge constrains and impacts their ability to search through it. So creativity is actually an interaction of a lot of different cognitive capacities and neural mechanisms that interact together. And we are now more and more trying to tease those apart, and also sometimes unsuccessful in teasing those apart. So there's also a lot of methodological challenges in how to ask the question that you ask, whether it's one or the other. And it seems like it's a combination of both. It's also a combination with all other things, which makes it really hard to study. How can I focus just on one thing is where the hard thinking has to happen. And we've developed different ways to try and do that. And it's a slow process of just trying to accumulate evidence across different studies that show the same phenomena. And then that helps us maybe point in the right direction. Other approaches are also looking in the brain to see how the brain neural mechanisms come into play here. So there's a lot of different ways to try and ask that question. But again, the short answer, even though I've been talking on and on about this, is it's a combination. And it's a question of whether we can examine these two different sources of information separately or not as a part of active debate.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment, because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. So I'm curious about how you could use all of that knowledge to enhance your creativity. So let's say you're 30 years old or you're 35 years old and your brain is filled with 30 years of stuff.
Yeah.
And it has certain semantic links or it's associated with each other. So are you stuck? You've got 30 years of uncreative stuff? Or can you reach inside your mind and build more of those distant connections? I mean, I could see if you're learning new stuff, that's a different question. Maybe you could learn in a different way. We can talk about that later. But yeah, what can you do? How can you take that 30 years of mental stuff and make yourself have more distant associations?
Well, one would be great to be 35 again, I guess. But here's an interesting thing that we have done. We've done some research asking these questions about knowledge with aging. So how does people who age, not just the age of 35, moving towards 60s and 70s, how does their memory change? Because there's one thing, and this relates to your question, one thing that is really interesting about what's called the lifespan studies, how people change across their lifespan in healthy aging, we're not talking about disease, is that they continue to constantly learn more information. So you can align this with maybe expertise. The 30-year-old, they are becoming more and more proficient in what they're doing, and they have this expertise effect, or what I like to call maturization of knowledge. Their knowledge becomes more and more organized even at the age of 35, and but even more later on, because they know more things. So they know more about table and they know more about chair. So the distance again, or the similarity between table and chair, decreases because they are more sensitive to how these two things, even though they share features, they're also different. So this is what's happening. Knowledge becomes more and more organized. And we see this in different phenomena. But then again, as I said earlier, that knowledge is crucial to create new ideas. So there is some sort of a balance or a sweet spot between or knowledge, accumulating knowledge, learning about stuff, and when the system becomes too organized. And we know from past research that there are fixation effects in expertise. So the more a person knows about something, the less creative in a way they become. And that's danger for us. Another question that I like to think about is how can we continue to optimize our cognitive system, our mental minds, to optimize between this sort of need for organization and structure, but also maintain flexibility and this ability to expand and search and move away and create different ideas. The way that we think that could happen is by pushing people, nudging them to try and constantly create connections between things that they already know. So we have some evidence, and we've done some research on this. This is still very early work, that learning things, or for example, solving riddles, which is part of a study that I've been doing with a colleague in Paris, helps create new connections between previously structured knowledge. And that goes to this feeling of insight when the light bulb flashes and I got it. This idea came to mind unexpectedly, and I'm so happy that I finally figured out the problem. So we have work that shows that one of the things that happens when people suddenly realize an idea is that there is these creations of links in their memory. That's really important to know that our memory system is dynamic in a way that it constantly fluctuates. So the more we think about things and the more we try to expand and think about things from different perspectives, that could likely, and we haven't tested this directly, facilitate this creation of new connections. We also know that just by asking people to try and be more creative or come up with less typical ideas, that already on its own helps. So in a way, there are very easy solutions. These are very short-term solutions, though. So we can push in lab settings people to become more distant in their ideas. It's unclear how much that's long-lasting relations. But the more we can increase one's interest and curiosity and attempt to connect different domains together, that should help. So it's not, when I talk to my parents, I say then don't just do Sudoku or Scrabble. Try to do things that you're not familiar with to learn a new language, perhaps, even though that's hard, because that will push our systems to try to create these links that were not before there, and that should have downstream effects on one's knowledge system that should lead to potentially a more flexible system that should help a person maintain their creativity.
So it is possible to do some mental exercise and enhance your ability to make these distant connections, like you were describing a study where people were
Yeah.
solving riddles, which I can imagine would require making that distant connection. So yeah, you're talking about, I don't know, mental workout might be mental exercise, just some techniques you can use.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of interest in that last quite a while now, and people are trying to do this. And there's a lot of interesting things that are getting out there for people. The question is how do you make these things engaging and for people to just stay and persist. We have a sort of a proof of concept tool we developed in my lab where we try to help people break away from mental fixation. And we do that. This is an example of a combination of mapping one structure and also thinking about this associative thinking process. So we have them come up with, they try to come up with creative ideas, and then they get stuck. They run out of ideas. This is something that always happens. When they do that, we give them an option in our web browser to ask for a recommendation. That recommendation, through the process, as they're writing down responses, we sort of map out where that person gets stuck in their memory system. And then we offer them word recommendations that try to push them out to move in a different direction. So they get into a dead end or some sort of a mental roadblock. Then we find the direction that maybe can help them find a different route, right? Like a navigation, recalibrate your mental route. And that helps for a little bit. So we're very in early stages there as well, but we have some sort of demonstration that we can help people, and maybe that exercising this with our tool may help in the future. I don't know. This is I have a lot of also applied aspirations. There's also relates to some clinical work that I've done in the past with people with high functioning autism, where we found that their memory is extremely rigid. This is about we're talking about creativity, and we suggested that maybe finding a way to help them create new edges could help. So yeah, creating new connections really matters, and there are ways to do that that are, in principle, not that difficult. It just requires us to stay motivated to do that. And one way that I'm investing a lot of my time is focusing in the last couple of years on how people ask questions and why asking questions matters. I don't know if you want to get into that now, but I would really like to talk about that.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned that earlier. There's so much research that shows that problem formulation or problem finding, it's sometimes called, is very important to creativity. It's not necessarily about coming up with a good list of ideas. If you are trying to solve the wrong problem, then your long list of ideas will be wasted. So you need to formulate the problem in a certain way. So, yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. What can you tell us about problem finding or open-ended questions?
So the origin story is that I got into creativity because I wanted to study how people ask questions. And that was something that a lot of people still say is very hard to do. And I find that really surprising because, especially I think we're scientists as well, but I think it's true in anything that we do. We ask a lot of questions all the time. And then some people are really good in asking questions, some people are not. And there's differences across us. But if this is such an important capacity, skill that we have, a tool that we have to ask questions, I think it's really important to understand why we ask questions and how that helps us do stuff. And this is where I started getting into creativity. They were already in my undergrad. And I really wanted to study how we ask questions. And it took me quite a while, a bit of a journey. But now this is something that we actually do. And the argument that I want to say is you mentioned problem finding and problem construction. These exactly are the things. People have been talking for a very long time on problem solving, how we solve problems and the way that we do this. Sometimes it's called searching through the solution space. The idea that we have different alternative solutions and we search through them and select. Here again is this word search and select and space. Now, how do we come up with the solution space is something that also should be asked. And the idea is that we do that first by creating a problem space, identifying what is the problem at hand. And it's extremely important in what some call ill-defined problems. These are problems, unlike how we are taught in school. Ill-defined problems are problems where we don't know what the variables of the problem is, we don't know what this required solution is, and we don't know what is the process that will lead us from the variables to the solution. And there's a lot of mess. This is how our life is. Our life is ambiguous, right? And the last couple of years have really showed how complex it is with pandemics and conflict and climate change and a lot of things. There's so much things, but it's even small stuff. Our day to day is full of these ill-defined problems that we need to solve, like even navigating, finding the shortest route, or getting home as early as possible. So there is work on problem finding. There's not a lot of work. That's unfortunate as well. And my take on this is focusing on what drives this ability to identify what a problem is. And my argument is that is through question asking. So I want to argue, and I've been arguing this, that questions are the mechanism that allows us to identify the problem. And we do this if we're good by asking good questions. And then that you could ask, what is a good question? And that's a really difficult question on its own. And there's many different aspects to what makes a question a good one. My focus is on this idea of complexity. Complexity is this idea that you want to have good questions that really help you get the most amount of information that you need to answer that question. And so it's not a difficult question, it's a complex question. A lot of times people confuse these two terms together. So a simple question could be really complex in what it drives at. And a way to also maybe give another example is that low complex questions are a lot of the things that we ask all the time. WH questions, what, where, when. These are called information retrieval questions that are considered less complex because the information that they seek is very concrete, right? So those should not be definitely that helpful or beneficial for creative acts. We have been doing this for a couple of years now. We developed a task where we ask people to ask questions on objects, and then we measure the complexity of these questions through a taxonomy of questions that was developed by a group of educators in the 1950s. And we show that the complexity of the question predicts or relates to their creativity, and specifically asking more complex questions leads to more creativity. So if we want to be creative, if we want to constantly try to push our system to learn more and create these edges or links, we should actually ask a lot of really complex questions as much as we can, constantly.
Oh, I love that research. And it sounds like something where you can take that research or that finding and you could start doing it right now. You could, I mean, it
Yeah,
makes me think I was flashing on children who are famous for asking, we might think of as stupid questions, right? Like, why is the sky blue?
yeah,
Where an adult wouldn't ask that question. You just say, hey, the sky's blue, you know,
right.
just stop asking that stupid question.
But that question is so actually it's a deep question. Why is the sky blue forces you to think, why is the sky blue? And then you need to talk about atmosphere and light and space, and you start thinking about all of that information that is sort of packed in a question that seems very mundane, as you said. And kids have the tendency, especially when young kids, to ask you questions that you sometimes you just can't deal with it. This is how it is. That's a really bad process. We really should try to constantly think about how to respond to our kids. But yeah, so we have a study that we published earlier, well, a couple months ago, where we show how complex question asking facilitates ill-defined problem solving and not defined problem solving, sort of open-ended versus closed-ended problems that we use. All this research is actually really fun because you constantly play with riddles and all these types of interesting contexts. And we are hoping to start a training or intervention study this year. We also wrote a theoretical paper where we align question asking and prompt engineering because everybody's interacting with ChatGPT. So let's help people understand how they can ask for more richer, complex information from the machine, from the AI model, and that should facilitate this more interesting co-creativity process where the person and the machine are interacting in more complex, that is likely more creative ways. So there's so much things that we are just trying to look at. So children is definitely the best important usual suspect to focus on with question asking, but we can make an impact on for many different types of communities, populations. And you asked before, when I've been talking about the work that I'm doing on aging and memory, and I've been asked, what can we do? So I was told, try to answer your grandchildren's questions. If you do that, that will force you, like you asked about the sky blue that you said, that will force us to start really thinking about what these questions are really are about. And then that could maybe, hopefully, again, help us expand, think, rethink, recombine. These action related terms are really important on our knowledge system that is becoming more and more organized and rigid in a way.
You got so much research underway, and I'm wondering, could you tell us what are you most excited about right now? What are you really excited about?
I'm excited about a lot of things. So the work on question asking is something that I feel is really, really important. And we are trying to also move towards more education sciences, as you said. And the other thing is that a lot of my work is on how our memory changes. Like I've talked about now on and on about aging and problem solving. And these type of research, I'm interested in measuring and understanding how our memory changes. And again, this because to me, it's really important to also understand how potentially we can help and improve and sort of find that optimization point that can help our systems maintain as much of its creative capacity as possible. So there's a lot of work that we're doing on how memory changes over time and how we search through it. And the last thing I may say, again, I have a lot of different ideas here on this question, is I am a cognitive scientist, so I really like trying to understand the basic cognitive mechanisms of such complex behavior. So this, again, we've done a lot of work on associative thinking, a lot of work on memory structure, and now a question is just trying to identify the pieces of the puzzle and then just try to build them together and find what is that big picture, that emergent phenomena that we call creativity, that people find so important. I love what I do. I really think about how there's so much in it. The World Economic Forum and the UN, a lot of really big think tanks and whatnot, they always talk about how creativity is critical for mankind. So I think we really need to understand what that is and how we can help enhance those capacities that allow us to be creative. And for mine, it's a small prism of study that's about knowledge, searching, and asking questions to acquire better information.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that fascinating research. I always like to end my interviews by asking, could you give us some sort of practical advice or some sort of tips or maybe an exercise that our listeners could do in the next week, something they can do that would enhance their creativity?
Yeah, well, two things. One is I said it already, so this allows me to say two things. But one is just try to ask a lot of questions as much as you can, and don't hold yourself back, and don't. There's no wrong questions, and there's no stupid questions, and there's just questions. Some of them are better for us, some are not. The other thing that I want to suggest is this really nice sort of exercise that I think you've talked about in the past. It's called the divergent association task. There's like an online tool for it. CNN covered it for a little bit. New York Times, this is a couple years ago. Work coming out of Australia, where it's a very simple thing. All you need to do is think of 10 things that are very different from each other. So that's an exercise that doing that, again, pushes the system to try and expand and move away and find things that are very different from each other. That on its own should have an impact on one's ability to expand their search. So I would say at least one of these two things are really should be and are very beneficial to maintaining the freshness and flexibility and richness of our memory systems that are really important in day-to-day behavior and creativity.
And any of us can do that. I like it because it doesn't cost anything. You don't need any complicated materials.
Simple things that help us a lot. This is what we need to focus on. The small things that just a couple of minutes a day, just while your people are walking or driving or whatever, just focus on that. It's much more beneficial than trying to solve sort of closed-ended problems. Think of constantly try to expand how you're thinking.
Dr. Yoed Kenett, thank you so much for joining us on the Science of Creativity.
Thank you. This was a blast. I'm so happy to have had the chance to talk about a little bit about my research. Thank you.
Dr. Yoed Kenett is such a star in creativity research. I'm delighted to have him on the show today. It's hard to keep track of all the topics he studied. We were only able to talk about a portion of his research. I'm glad that we got to focus on his studies of associative thinking and how you're more creative when you combine very different concepts. And his studies of question asking are a major contribution to our understanding of creativity. Dr. Kenett shows us the potential implications of the science of creativity. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.